The Inter-Ministerial Committee on Land Reform has given an update on the outcomes of a recent meeting that was chaired by Deputy President David Mabuza. Earlier this month, Land Reform Minister Thoko Didiza said close on 900 farms of state land would be released to the public. Well, to find out more about what the expropriation bill entails, we're joined by Professor Ruth Hall from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Professor Hall, good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, let's just take a look at this expropriation bill and what is being proposed here versus what has been the process underway to amend Section 25 of the Constitution.
Thanks, Cathy. I think that for many people, they feel, well, haven't we already discussed this for the past 2 years? So there are actually separate processes. On the one hand, we have both the ANC and the EFF in Parliament pushing towards amending Section 25, the property clause in the Constitution. But simultaneously, we have an expropriation bill process. So we have had, since 1996, an odd situation in which we have a constitution that says that government can expropriate for land reform purposes, and we have an expropriation act that dates from 1975 that says government can only expropriate when it's acquiring property for public purposes like roads, schools, dams, etc. It can't expropriate from one private citizen to give to another. So, for instance, when one community is claiming back land that they were unfairly dispossessed of, and the current owner doesn't want to sell, in effect, that claim gets stalled. So we haven't had expropriation as a mechanism to acquire land for land reform purposes, even though it's in the Constitution. In that sense, in my view, this is 24 years too late, but nonetheless, it's the right thing that we have an expropriation bill that says when there's an overriding demand for transformation and land reform, government can expropriate. It's what the Constitution already has said for all these years. And it also says that the compensation must be determined on a case-by-case basis, not necessarily market price, not necessarily zero, but it will depend on a case-by-case basis.
Expropriation has been a central issue of the amendment to Section 25. So the fact that this bill is before Parliament, does it mean that we'll see it included in some form or another as part of the amendments to Section 25 of the Constitution? So my point is that, yes, these have been parallel processes, but at which point do they converge? And, you know, are we likely to see all the concerns around Section 25 and expropriation fall under the expropriation bill?
Cathy, no. There are actually separate issues, and one is national level framework legislation. Let's remember that the expropriation bill is about defining government's powers to acquire property compulsorily, which all governments have around the world. It's a power of eminent domain. It's about saying how those powers can be used, and it specifies things like when people must receive notices, their rights to appeal, etc. The constitutional amendment process, it has been revived. There is an ad hoc committee within Parliament which is meant to be looking into this amendment of Section 25. Personally, I think that the amendment to Section 25 at this point is primarily symbolic. The expropriation bill is what will give effect to it. But I would say there's a wider issue here. I think that today what we saw was both Minister Thoko Didiza, Minister of Agriculture and Land Reform, and also Minister Patricia de Lille, Minister of Public Works, who of course is responsible for the Expropriation Act, that both of them being at pains to emphasize that, you know, the rights of property holders will be fairly dealt with, etc. In my view, this is a very moderate piece of legislation. Many people might see warning signs when they hear about expropriation. I mean, expropriation is an essential tool that government has to have. The question is, how is it going to use it? And I think we haven't heard nearly enough about that. So I think that what's really important is the political messaging and the policy that should be going alongside this. And I think we're not getting that.
And the issue of how compensation takes place has also been one that has been debated upon, and who effectively has the final word. Are courts the ultimate arbiter, or is it in the hands of the political head effectively? This law sets clarity to that, doesn't it?
Well, yes. Let's be clear. Very often, expropriation across many countries is an administrative function. The minister expropriates. In fact, the South African government expropriates quite often. For instance, SANRAL and other public entities expropriate often a small portion of people's properties and compensate them. So we're quite accustomed to doing expropriations, but not for land reform purposes. So, of course, in this context, a lot of stock was put into the question of who would decide on the expropriation and who decides on the level of compensation. Now, I think that this has been a dividing line within the ruling party. And what many people have argued is that, in fact, what's very important is to distinguish that the minister has the power to make a decision, but the courts should have the power to review that. So there's always a judicial appeal possible. But what this bill is doing, according to Minister de Lille, is that, in fact, the decision has been to put decision-making squarely in the hands of the courts. I think that this is something that needs to be debated. And I think that asking the courts to make decisions about compensation in every single case is probably not a good idea. One of the things that our Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform proposed when we reported last July was that government should draft a compensation policy, and that should set out how government wants to approach compensation, because up to now they haven't said, do they want to pay market price, do they want to pay zero, when would they like to compensate, and how are they going to approach just and equitable compensation? Nobody knows. So I think that what's really missing is a compensation policy that can and should be included as regulations to the expropriation bill. That's then what could be tested in the courts, and the courts can say this is a fair approach or it's not, rather than asking the courts to look at valuations on every single case. I think that we're going to see this becoming a problem in the future. But I think that very broadly, many people might feel, is government going too far on expropriation? My view is that this is an incredibly modest bill. It doesn't actually do enough to take us forward, but it's not just legislation that's needed, it's policy.
Professor Hall, you're also drawing the link between what the purpose of this bill serves and that of Section 25, what it adds to the conversation and the calls to nationalize some of the country's resources.
Well, of course, that is, in a sense, we've been playing word games a bit in this country for the past few years, because when the EFF called for expropriation without compensation, the call was for nationalizing land. It wasn't expropriating and paying no compensation for a particular property in an arbitrary fashion. It was actually to change the entire property system in the country. The ANC has responded, and I think that various constituents within the ANC have different needs and interests and expectations of expropriation without compensation. So I think that this became clear today when, for instance, a journalist asked Minister Toko Didiza, if you're saying that this expropriation bill has been deemed by the state law advisors to be constitutional, and therefore now it's been approved, it's been gazetted, and it can be debated in Parliament, at the same time your party is pushing for amending the Constitution, but you're saying that this bill is already constitutional. What's the reason for the amendment? And her answer was precisely what we've heard many times, which is to make explicit that which is already implicit in the Constitution. So I think that the key thing here is that what we need is greater clarity politically about when and under what circumstances the state wants to pay compensation set at market level or below market level or at zero. Under what circumstances? Now, our report advised on some of those issues, but I would also emphasize this wasn't just a media briefing today about the expropriation bill. It was meant to be a report back by the Inter-Ministerial Committee, which was established 2 years ago to oversee a wide-ranging process of fixing the land reform process, and not just the question of expropriation. It was meant to deal with issues around insecure tenure in the communal areas. It was meant to deal with demand for urban land. It was meant to deal with farm workers. It was meant to deal with support for small-scale farmers. So a wide range of issues. And in fact, our report that was presented to the Inter-Ministerial Committee and to Cabinet made 31 recommendations. The expropriation bill was one of those. But I think that what South Africans still haven't heard back from government is, what are you doing about the other 30? What's happening with the reform of the Land Claims Court, which hasn't had any permanent judges? It needs to have an expanded mandate beyond the dealing of land claims. It needs to deal with other types of disputes. We propose that there should be a land rights protector with a broad mandate, similar to the public protector. We see so many land-related conflicts, whether it be urban land occupations, whether it be corruption in the land redistribution process. That was another proposal. There's a need for a land records bill to provide clarity for 60% of the people in this country who have no clear legal recognition of their right to occupy the land that they occupy. So we have an elaborate title deed system for a minority of people. Most people fall outside that. There were recommendations around farm workers. There were recommendations around how to deal with climate change and redistributing water alongside land and managing that. So I think that there's been a great silence on a range of issues. And I would say that this is the moment to respond not only on the expropriation bill, but to ask the Inter-Ministerial Committee, where are you at with the other 30 recommendations? What is your response? Which of them have you decided not to take on board? Which of them will you address? And what is your time frame? Because, this is a committee chaired by Deputy President David Mabuza. 6 of the key cabinet ministers responsible for land issues are in that Inter-Ministerial Committee. And I think that the public deserves a report back.
Professor Ruth Hall, thank you so much for that comprehensive insight. She's with the Institute for Poverty, Land, Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape.